introduce our guest. His name is Dr. John West. He's Vice President and Senior Fellow of the Discovery Institute in Seattle. He serves as Managing Director of the Institute's Center for Science and Culture. And by the way, he co-founded that institute, that center, with philosopher of science Stephen Meyer, who we love, way back in 1996. His current research examines the impact of science and scientism on public policy and culture. His other areas of expertise include constitutional law, American government and institutions, and religion and politics. John West holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and was previously an associate professor of political science at Seattle Pacific University, which is a university that we're going to talk about some in this podcast. And at that university, he chaired the Department of Political Science and Geography, and he has directed a dozen documentaries. He's written or edited some 13 books, including the book we're going to be talking about today, his most recent book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, and the subtitle's important: Why America's Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. One of the striking parts of your book that sticks in my mind, it's riveted in my mind, is an example, and it's in the Lutheran community. So you have the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod going down a very bad path, but ending up reversing that path. And then you have the Evangelical Lutheran Church, kind of ironic that's called evangelical, going down the opposite path. Tell that story.
I'm so glad you like it. That was added very late because I knew someone who I didn't know at the time, but I taught a Sunday school class that morphed into this book, and she told me about it because her dad was one of the professors, one of the Orthodox professors who stayed. And so then I researched it, and I think Christians need to know about this also to show how faithfulness God can honor, but also if you're not faithful, you can actually see in real time what happens. So the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church in the 1970s, their key seminary, basically was increasingly dominated by professors who basically adopted the old style theological liberalism, that the Bible wasn't really necessarily accurate, that the miracles didn't necessarily happen, what the Bible said, and they were devaluing that. And so there was a lot, the denomination got worried about it because this was their future pastors that were being done. And there were some faithful people in the seminary, but they were increasingly belittled and berated by the increasingly, I'd say, non-Orthodox people there. And so to the credit of the denominational officials at the time is that they did investigate and they wouldn't let go. And when they found out what was really happening, they basically said, well, no, that's not our confessions. We have stated confessions that you're supposed to uphold. And they basically insisted on that. And even when they were demonized, I mean, it's really interesting. I went back to some of the original documents, how this played out. They were demonized as being anti-Christian for upholding, traditional teaching of biblical authority. They were berated as being unloving. They were berated as Pharisees. I mean, it was high voltage rhetoric against them, but they methodically, carefully, they said, no, this is what we stand for. These are our confessional faith. That's what our seminary is supposed to stand for. And so then the majority faculty, who by that time had sort of abandoned biblical faithfulness, said, okay, well, if you do that, we're just going to leave and start our own seminary. And basically, and I think they were hoping that they would get the denomination to back down, but the denomination didn't. And so something about basically 90% of the faculty and students left. A faithful remnant stayed. And at the time, the news media was saying, oh, see, they've destroyed the denomination. They've destroyed their seminary, and they're going to go out of existence. I would say even if that happened, well, they were staying faithful, and that's, we don't just do things based on success. We do things based on what's right. But an amazing story. Within just a few years, they rebuilt the seminary, and the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church went on. It still today has close to 2 million baptized members and is still the largest theologically conservative Lutheran denomination in the United States. And Francis Schaeffer, at the time actually went to encourage them after this happened, and he gave a chapel. And I found this talk by him that I'd never known before. And in fact, many of the people who read the book, who knew a lot about Schaeffer's, didn't know that he went there, where he basically thanked them for what they did and noted that this, in most cases, denominations go heterodox and they're never recovered. This was the first time in his view that he knew in history, certainly in modern American history, where a denomination was going in one direction and they actually flipped it back to faithfulness. And so he was encouraging them. But what's also, so that's the story of faithfulness, and all the good that was led to. But the other part of it is, well, what happened to all these professors and students, future ministers, who went into what eventually became the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which, as you know, is ironic because it's not at all evangelical. Well, these professors who were protesting their innocence, that they were really faithful Bible believers, even though they weren't, they helped become leaders in the new denomination of pushing for acceptance of gay marriage, devaluing the Bible, and everything that basically played out in the ECLA. And so you could actually see what would have happened to the future of the Missouri Synod Lutheran had those few denominational officials not had the backbone and the wisdom and the courage, and I'd say the biblical love, to stand for truth. And so you can see on the one side, the benefits of the fruitfulness, and then the benefits of those who left. The consequences of those who left.
Yeah, so you had some faithful board members.
You did. And some denominational officials who were, who the board members were representing.
Yeah. You have a section in the book, it starts with cures, and the first chapter is chapter 10, A Call to Wisdom. You talk about what we should do about Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. We should obviously immerse ourselves in the Word of God. I say memorize the Word of God, meditate on the Word of God, mine the Word of God for all its substantial riches. You also talk about the importance of prayer, and you can sort of brush that aside. I mean, that's sort of understandable, but this is really important. We can talk about it, or we can actually do it, and doing it makes all the difference in the world. I'm sure that was a big part of the transition for the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church.
Yeah, no, I think there are multiple aspects to prayer. Praise, confession, thankfulness. But I also think that I've seen in my work at Discovery, and in one case that I share in the book, of that intercessory prayer is also really, really important. And I tell in the book how when Seattle Pacific brought a big proponent of open theism, this idea that God himself doesn't know the future, to the school to speak in the official chapel and to engage the faculty. My wife and I were part of a young person's Bible study that we helped lead, and we had the leaders. We were all praying that God would basically safeguard the students from this just really erroneous belief. And I later had a discussion. We were discussing other things with the person who was the dean of the chapel, who supported bringing this person. So it wasn't that he disagreed with the person, but I asked him how that went, because actually at the time I was actually on sabbatical writing another book, Darwin Day in America, I think. So I wasn't actually there. I knew about it, but I didn't attend the chapel. So, but later I asked the person who had arranged it, how that went. And he said, oh, it was one of the worst chapels we ever had, because the students just couldn't make a head or tail of what the guy was saying and what his point was. It was just so airy-fairy. And I thought, wow, what an answer to prayer, that God sort of made what he said babble to the students. And so, I have other things, I've experienced things like that. I think every, Christian has to a degree, but prayer is really talking to the living God. And so, and God honors our prayers in a variety of different ways. But one way it's a real treat, is when God, calls you to pray about something, and that you can see his particular answer in a way that you can see here and now, and you don't have to wait to heaven to see, the answer. And so I do think that we need to remember we can't do it in our own power. And I know when I was an elder of a church, can think of some very difficult decisions we had to make, where spending, an hour walking in prayer where things really became clear. And it was through praying about it that God sort of made clear, well, this is the key thing. And so, yeah, I think we need to recognize doing God's work in God's way. And that's something Francis Schaeffer liked to talk about. I think they got it from Hudson Taylor, and it's a good thing to remember.
Yeah, and I was so encouraged that you had the temerity to believe that things can change at Seattle Pacific University. You saw a glimmer of hope there. I mean, you're not Pollyannish about it, but you did see a glimmer of hope, and you're even willing to pray that there's going to be a systemic change there.
Yeah, so I want to be fair to them. If people read my book, if they get to the end, they'll see that in the last couple of years, there was a change on the board and the president. And I do think that some of the new people are trying to do their best to move things back to a more biblically orthodox. It's a mixed bag. We'll see. I am praying about it. If my fear is I don't know that they understand just how deep the change is going to need to be, but and they've given conflicting signals. But I do know that there have been some really good members of the board who are trying, and I pray that God will bless that.